So today we're starting a new series on the channel where I look at some of the most famous storytelling tropes and give you my opinion on them and give you some examples of stories where I think they work really well and stories where I think they work less well. And we're starting the series with what is probably one of the most famous storytelling tropes, and that is love at first sight. A trope that I've seen take a little bit of flack on YouTube recently, and so I want to unpack the trope and maybe defend it a little bit. In this video, I'll talk about why I think the trope is universally used, why I think people loved it so much in the past, and why I think people are maybe hating on it a little bit more in the present. But firstly, what exactly is it? Well, it's a self-explanatory trope. You usually have two lovers, often young but not always. They see each other for the first time, and they instantly fall in love. Think of Romeo and Juliet as the archetypal and one of the best instances of love at first sight. Oftentimes, though, it goes a little bit deeper than that. It's not just that they love each other, it's that the love is quite extreme. There'll be lots of waxing lyrical, lots of poetry, and in the case of Romeo and Juliet, of course, pretty tragic events, which some people find not very believable, precisely because usually in this trope, people do all kinds of crazy things, despite the fact that they don't really know each other. It's that spark that just seems to capture someone, and then loads of crazy romantic things ensue. So why do some people seem to dislike this trope? Well, one common answer to this that I see a lot is that it's not very realistic. And this makes sense because typically true love, especially the kind of love where you're going to sacrifice yourself for someone, it takes time to develop. Yes, people can be instantly attracted to each other, and that can be quite passionate and strong, but that isn't something that is going to lead to these extreme behaviors that we see in tragedies, for example, like Romeo and Juliet. Thinking of some novels that I read quite recently that I saw this trope at work and didn't think it worked very well, that would be The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. There are lots of romances within this fantasy series that just come out of nowhere, and it almost seems like Jordan is just using this easy trope of two people just fall instantly in love so that he can ignore the busy work of building that romance because he's just declared these two are in love now. It's very, very passionate, and we can sort of gloss over the sort of muddy details of building a relationship. And so that isn't an example of something where I don't think it is very realistic and where I don't think it ultimately works. It's just not very believable. At the same time, though, I think we have to be careful when we criticize a trope for not being realistic enough. Because to say that literary works should be realistic, depending on what we mean by that, but it can mean that works are supposed to reflect real life in a very mundane sense. And I think that this is to misunderstand at least a lot of genres of literature. This kind of realism is something that I see coming in literature as time has gone by. When I think of the great novels of the 1800s, for example, there's a big focus on social realism, on grittiness, on all of that stuff, on really capturing the psychology of people in detail, all of that stuff as well. And as time's gone on, it seems like the best novels, the novels that are classed as literary and worthy, tend to be those novels that are very realistic and focusing on typically social issues or psychological issues, whereas novels that are more whimsical, fantastical, or bizarre tend to get relegated to children's literature, or at the very least, it's not top-shelf literature. But if you go back before then, you find all kinds of examples of the supernatural in literature. Shakespeare himself wrote lots of plays that include magic or ghosts or gods in them. So it's something that as you go more back in time, you find that people are more happy with the supernatural, probably because people typically just believed in this stuff a lot more as well than people do as time goes by. And if you look at the modern day, you can even see this realism creeping into the fantasy genre. Something like Game of Thrones sort of prides itself as a series on the fact that it is sort of a historical narrative, and yes, magic is there, but it's really about the politics and that gritty, real stuff. And so that's another example of realism creeping in. But what does this mean for love at first sight as a trope? Well, I think that when you have this realist perspective, you fail to see something that literature can do and art can do in general, which is that it takes something that we experience in ordinary life, in this case, that instant romantic attraction that you feel towards someone, and then it intensifies it and focuses on it to really make you, the reader or the audience, focus on that yourself and really feel that intense form of this thing that's been crystallized. So really, it's not about love at first sight being realistic in the sense that it's copying real life. It's taking something that definitely does happen, people have that instant spark all the time, and then it's intensifying it to really make you feel how powerful that kind of emotion is. And I think that that is what love at first sight does as a trope. Thinking outside of literature, you could think of a painter who really wants to capture the rich ripeness of an apple. And so he chooses a really red apple, he chooses a color that really is too intense. You don't really see apples like this in real life, but when you look at the painting, it really captures and intensifies that experience when you look at a succulent fruit, and it really brings that to the fore. And so that, I think, is something that we should think of when we think about tropes. It's not about the author trying to realistically depict a relationship. What they're trying to do is to capture that spark, that passion, and that is what I think the trope is trying to do, and why I think Romeo and Juliet, for example, is one of the best examples of the trope, because it really shows you that intense kind of feeling that you get, and obviously it leads to very tragic results, but that's part of the intensification of that feeling as well. This is why, when it's done well anyway, I don't mind the trope. I think it's quite powerful, because it does capture something actually that is real. It transforms it into something more powerful and intense, and so it seems like it's sometimes not very real, but actually ultimately it is. It's a very deep experience that we can have, and in the best works it really brings that out for us to see. Another speculation of mine as to why I think this trope maybe is on the decline, or at least less popular, or people are more openly critical of it, is maybe it's just that when it comes to romance in the modern day, we are sort of spoilt for choice. Not necessarily in the sense that we can just have lots of partners, although I'm sure some people can. It's less about that and more that we're surrounded by beautiful people all the time. There are celebrities on magazines, in advertising, there's people in our social circle, we have apps that we can just see people across the whole country, and if we change the country we're on the app, we can see them in other countries. And so beauty is something that is kind of ten a penny in a way. Obviously not everyone is beautiful, but you can quite easily see beauty in a way that, if you think about the past, that really wasn't the case. If you lived your whole life in a village, it's very likely that most people there are not very well off, and so can't really afford to, maintain themselves and be beautiful. And so when you see someone who's beautiful for the first time, you might actually be struck in a much more intense way than you would be for someone who just sees it all the time. And so I wonder if maybe the reason why this trope seems to be more popular in the past is because it just was a more common experience for people to really be struck by beauty in a way that doesn't happen as much as time has gone on and beauty has just become a little bit more everywhere. There's also another criticism that comes up, which is that romances that are based on love at first sight tend to be shallow relationships. And again, this makes sense because typically love at first sight usually is the case that this will happen where they just see the person and they're completely struck by the beauty. Now we have to be careful because sometimes they see them do something, so they might see them do an act of charity, or maybe they're giving a rousing speech, so it's not always just the physical appearance. There could be something that the character is showing in terms of what they're doing at the time that also captures the person as well as their beauty. But still, there is a point about shallowness, because after all, if you're going to lay down your life for someone that you've only just met, well, how much do you really know that person? It's a very extreme thing to do given that you don't know the person very well. So I think shallowness is a reasonable criticism here. But again, we have to be careful because the ways in which romance works in novels, again, is not exactly the same. It doesn't play by the same rules as the way that romance works in the real world. And when it comes to beauty in fiction, it's often used as a symbol for something, right? So if you think of innocence, of virtue, typically in a novel, someone who has innocence and virtue will be portrayed in a beautiful way. And someone who is evil will typically be portrayed in not necessarily an ugly way, but, usually in an ugly way. But sometimes then maybe they might be more sexualized, whereas a good person might have a sort of more innocent, pure beauty. And you do find these tropes in literature as well. The way in which a character appears often does say something about their personality, and beauty is one way that we can do this. And so one reason why a character might have love at first sight in a story is because they're not technically just struck by the beauty. They also are struck by the thing that this beauty symbolizes. So again, it is not necessarily shallow in the way that it would be in real life, because there's often more going on under the surface of a novel that might explain why a character is drawn to someone beautiful. I think the best reason to criticize love at first sight as a trope is less about the trope itself and more about how it's being used in a story and whether it's believable in the context of that story. And by believable here, I don't mean that it's realistic. What I mean is you take a look at the genre, you take a look at the characters, the atmosphere, the mood, and you ask, given all of these things, does love at first sight make sense in the story? And oftentimes it will, sometimes it won't. If someone really is trying to tell a deep, really realist, psychological, narrative drama type story, then yeah, maybe love at the first sight is not going to work in that context, because maybe you should be focusing on the more mundane aspects of building a relationship. But if it's a fantasy novel or a romance novel, then the trope becomes more appropriate, it seems to me. Also though, another thing that matters, and this really does apply across the board to me, it's not just about love at first sight as a trope, it's about what happens after this occurs. So we can all agree, I think, that people can have a spark. They can look at each other and they're madly in love, or they feel like they are. But what really matters and what really sells a relationship in a book or in any kind of story really is what happens after this. Do the two characters have chemistry with each other? Can they hold a conversation that is not just bizarre and awkward? Obviously, some degree of awkwardness might make sense in this situation because you're, awkward because of your strong feelings. But at the same time, it has to work. They have to have chemistry. The relationship has to be developed. And one of the things, going back to the Wheel of Time, that I found is that Jordan wouldn't necessarily do that work. He sort of just took the characters to be in love, and that was that. There were some examples in his book where he didn't do this, but I found that to be quite common in his books. So I think that's a thing to look out for when you're reading a book. It's not so much, oh, here we go, we've got this trope again. It's, where are we going from here? And one reason why I think Romeo and Juliet is a great exploration of this trope and a great use of it is because, firstly, Romeo and Juliet are young lovers, right? And that's what they are the archetype of. They're teenagers. Teenagers are known for their strong emotions, their passions. So, firstly, we've got two characters for whom it makes sense for them to have this strong passion. We also have this forbidden love aspect, which typically does also highlight the intensity of emotions, right? I've never cheated on anyone, but I have heard from people who have that the cheating itself can sometimes make the relationship more intense because it's forbidden, and obviously it is a forbidden romance between Romeo and Juliet. So we have this intensification of the passion as well. It makes sense that they would speak and wax lyrical in the way that they do because it's a love, story, so they're sort of meant to do this. So all of this stuff makes perfect sense. And if we see their death as a sort of showing the tragedy of this kind of intense love, then it also makes sense. It's less about Shakespeare trying to be realistic and showing us what a teenage relationship is like. And it's more about him showing us what intense passion and intense love is like, what forbidden love is like, and what it can do to two people. And so that, for me, is why I think Romeo and Juliet is one of the best examples of this kind of trope being used. So to wrap up then, I think it is a great trope, but I think that it all depends on how it's being used in a story, whether it makes sense. Is it an interesting use of the trope? Is it just kind of boring and pedestrian, or is something interesting happening? These are all the kinds of questions I would ask when it comes to this trope. But I do think that it is something that is undersold a little bit by critics that I see discussing it. I think there is a lot to the trope, and the fact that it does remain largely still very popular. People do love to have romance and passion in stories, and this is one of the most effective ways to bring that about. Let me know down in the comments though, what do you think about this trope? Do you enjoy it? And if so, why? Do you hate it and why? And what are some of the books that you think are really good examples of either? And as I said, let me know in the comments too what kind of tropes or storytelling themes and ideas you'd like me to discuss in future videos. But until then, take care everyone. Ta-ra!